pericope ends, the story here ends, and then we just move on sort of to the next story. Elisha is safe, his servant has seen the angels, and then it just moves on. And when we read these kinds of things in the historical books, these are, 2 Kings is considered to be a historical book. This is what we take from it, right? It's like, okay, that's really great. We know that there's some people that have prophetic insight, so they can tell what's happening from a distance or what's going to happen in the future, some sort of truth that they could do, and they have great faith in God, and so they could see the way that God is supporting them. Wonderful. That's the story that happened thousands of years ago. What does that have to do with me today? And what does this have to do with spiritual guidance? One of the things that we see that is directly related to this story is another story that actually happens in the desert that plays out the spiritual truth of this very chapter here in 2 Kings. It's the story of St. Moses the Black and his spiritual guide, St. Isidore. They were in Shihit, which is Wadi Notrun. And that's where it is that St. Moses had converted from paganism into Christianity and became a monk. And as a side note, for those who don't know, and something that I'm very happy to pronounce, the one who baptized St. Moses was not St. Isidore, which would have been, of course, a great blessing, but it was St. Macarius the Great, who was the one that was in charge of Shihit, right? So St. Isidore, whose spiritual father is St. Macarius the Great, takes Moses to him, takes Moses to St. Macarius, and that's who baptizes him. And so you see that there's this chain of fatherhood there, right? There's a spiritual guide for his spiritual son, who is a spiritual guide to his own spiritual son. And this is the story here. I know it's very small, so I'm going to read it to you guys. It's a very famous story. It's actually the very first of the sayings for St. Moses in his life that's attributed to him in the sayings of the fathers. And it's a short story. But I want you to keep in mind what it is that we just read in 2 Kings when we read this. There was a time when Abba Moses of Petra was terribly embattled by porneia. That is lustful thoughts. And that's the same word where we get pornography from, porneia. This is what he's battling, right? He's a monk, he's in his cell, he's battling this, and it's a very bitter battle of thoughts. Recall again, for those of you that don't know, that this is Abba Moses the Black, who lived a very prodigal life before, right? He was a murderer and a thief, and for sure lived a life that he was very steeped in his lusts, the lusts of the flesh. And so when he's having a battle of thoughts, with lustful thoughts, this is not just the kind of lustful thoughts that, of course, are very challenging for many of us to endure. These are also memories that he has of what he himself had experienced. And so when you're trying to distance yourself from something that's happened in the past and you're trying to forget that, and the devil continues to come and battle you with this. And for someone that was, again, very steeped in sin, that is trying to live a life according to Christ, this is a very bitter battle. When he could remain in his cell no longer, he went and revealed it to Abba Isidore, which is his spiritual guide. The elder invited him to return to his cell, but he would not accept that, saying, "Abba, I cannot." So Abba Isidore is saying, "Just go back to your cell." He's like, I can't do that. It's too hard on me. So he took him and brought him up onto the housetop with him and said to him, "Look to the west." He looked and saw a multitude of demons. They were milling around together and shouting, ready for battle. Then Abba Isidore also said to him, "Look to the east." He looked and saw an innumerable host of glorious angels. Then Abba Isidore said to him, "Look, these are they who are sent to the holy ones by the Lord to help them. They in the west are the ones who are fighting against them. They who are on our side are the more numerous." When he had given thanks to God, Abba Moses took courage from this and returned to his own cell. So, the spiritual truth that we see that was in 2 Kings chapter 6 is now revealed to us, right? This is how it is that it's applicable for us in our own lives. Abba Moses is there. Also consider to yourself that Abba Moses at this time is not Saint Moses the Black, right? He's a struggler. He's like us. He's in the middle of the battle. And the battle is so rough that he wants to leave, right? He doesn't just want to leave his cell. He wants to leave monasticism. He's saying this is too much of a battle. And this is something I assume that happens with many of us as well, that they say, the things that are asked of me as a Christian that I have to endure are so numerous, and the battle gets really hard sometimes, where when I'm trying to battle against myself, and that doesn't just have to be lustful thoughts, right? It could be my own pride. It could be my desire to have my will heard. I need to be right. And if I'm not right and I have to struggle against that, and people keep telling me, you have to be humble, you have to be humble. You have to take, third tier, fourth, fifth tier. You can't be the first, right? Be seated in last place and say, I can't do that. It's too much for me, right? Or if I'm struggling against anger and you say, well, it's just too much. How am I supposed to deal with these emotions in such a way where I am honest with myself and honest with God, and I'm not just faking it so that I don't feel like I'm lying to myself, but so that I'm not just completely given over to this anger. And when we go through this kind of stuff in life, we find that it's extremely challenging, especially if you're trying to be mindful of what it is that you're doing, right? If you're trying to do it. If you're not doing that, right? If you're just saying like, oh, well, I'm a Christian, I go on Sunday and I take communion, and then you're just living your life the way that you normally would, then every opportunity that's presented to you, whether it's lust or anger or any of those things, doesn't really bring about such a battle that's inside of you, because you'll end up just falling very quickly, and then you just move on with your day, and it's no big deal. But if you see every time that you're mindful of the battle, and you say, now I'm going to try to take it seriously, now I'm going to try to apply what it is that the gospel is telling me to live by, suddenly you find that the spiritual life is extremely challenging. And many people say, well, I don't want to do that. And so some people end up being overcome by this and living a very sinful kind of life, whether inside the church or outside of it. And some people end up killing themselves, right? And we see that, and it's not, again, it's not just something that happens contemporarily. The stories of the Desert Fathers abound with this, because we see that it's a very, very challenging reality. When we see what happened with Elisha and the young man that was with him, notice that the person that is spoken about that's under his care is a young man, is a servant, right? The young man that's under his care. Elisha knows because he has experience. He's the spiritual guide. He knows who's there to be able to protect him. The young man lives with Elisha. So you can imagine that would be like if you lived at Abuna Carolus or Abuna Andrew's house, right? And you're constantly around them. And you're just trying to take in as much of the good that they have to teach. So you're constantly with them and you're asking them about all kinds of stuff, and your life is just steeped in this. Whenever they read, you read. Whenever they pray, you pray. And so you'd think by osmosis, then it must just happen that I'm going to be fine. This young man sees what's coming, and for all intents and purposes, from a logical standpoint, he is absolutely right. Right? There's no way that they're going to be able to stand against this. But Elisha, because he has experience and he has this faith, as a good spiritual guide, prays on behalf of his son, the one to whom he's entrusted spiritually, so that God may open his eyes. And this is exactly what it is that St. Isidore does for St. Moses. Now, perhaps we would then say, okay, maybe my spiritual guide then isn't praying hard enough for me because I don't see the angels that are in the skies. But I would say that the battle is probably not as hard as it was. And we have lots of points of support in our lives as well. With that said, there are obviously lots of people that end up seeing these kinds of things as well that give us this understanding from a spiritual truth perspective that this is in fact what's happening. So the reason why I wanted to lead with this here is because usually when we read with St. Moses the Black, you'll read his stories, and there are plenty of stories that are there about him. When he's called to judge a fellow monk and he takes the bag of sand and he lets the sand drop from behind him, or how it was that he was living before, or when they came to ask him to be a priest and then threw him out of the church and they witnessed his humility. All of these kinds of things we'll read about. But there is a very lengthy discourse, there's actually two of them, that he had that's written down that tells us precisely what the depth of St. Moses' spiritual insight was on a couple of topics. And you can find this in a book that's called The Conferences by St. John Cassian. St. John Cassian was someone that was from outside of Egypt that was sent to Egypt so that he could go learn from the monks there. So monasticism was obviously thriving at this point. This was the end of the 4th century. And people had heard that in this particular area in Wadi Matrun, in Shahit, that these are where the giants are, of course, because the great giant is there, St. Macarius the Great, and he's guiding them in this. And so John Cassian is sent there so that he can go and have these conversations with the monks, with the purpose of writing down the conversations, going back to his own country, and establishing monasticism there. So they want as much of this spiritual insight as possible from these tried and true practice monks, so that they have something written down and then they can go back and apply it. And so you could find that you can find it online for free as well. It's called The Conferences, and the first 2 conferences are Ava Moses, and so it's St. Moses the Black, and they're very deep. They're probably much more challenging than what most people would assume would be coming out of the mouth of St. Moses the Black, because again, I think that we have a concept in our minds that when we read these kinds of stories like this, for example, this comes from the sayings of the Desert Fathers. They're meant to be very short sayings that you can remember and live by very quickly, right? Oh, you remember when this happened to Ava Moses? But if you have a very long discourse, you see what it is that they end up speaking about. One part of this discourse is what I want to be able to cover here today, and it's about this spiritual guidance from St. Moses' perspective. And again, the reason why I wanted to cover Elisha first and then St. Moses is so that you could see that the fathers are not speaking out of just blind theory, right? They're not sitting there and saying, what's the most beautiful thing that I can come up with, that I can say, of how a person should live, even though I don't live this way. I think that's usually what we end up doing when we give lessons, myself included, because we don't have that kind of experience. So we just say, okay, what's the most beautiful ideal that I can speak towards? And then I'm just going to speak about that. Whereas for them, this is real, right? This is a reality, so that when they're speaking this, again, it's not theory. This is something that has been born out in their flesh. And so this is what we see from St. Moses the Black. This is what he says. True discretion is not obtained except by true humility. The first proof of this humility will be if not only everything that is to be done, but also everything that is thought of is offered to the inspection of the elders, so that, not trusting in one's own judgment, one may submit every respect to their understanding and may know how to judge what is good and bad according to what they have handed down. There's 3 slides that we're going to go over here. This is the first part of that. And again, this is a fragment of the discourse that's there. I would venture to say many people don't even know that this thing exists. Like I said before, if you were to go and read it, I would also venture to say that many people would assume that St. Moses would not be speaking this way. But look at what it is that he's saying here, right? What is the sign of humility? That not only everything that you do, you go and say it to your spiritual guide, but it's the things that you think that you would go and confess that to your spiritual guide. And again, he's not saying this from the perspective of, okay, well, let's see if we can get everyone in the church to go and have a meeting with Abuna one-on-one so that they can do this thing for 15 minutes, and they do that on a regular basis, and then that's what makes you a good Christian. That's not what he's talking about, right? He's saying if you want to cultivate virtue, right? Because that is what it means to be truly Christian. If you actually want to cultivate good virtue in Christ, then the way that you will do this is that you will submit to someone else. You will submit your actions to this other person. You will submit your thoughts to this other person. This is what I'm struggling with. And this applies for everybody in the church, right? I think this is something that we like to impress on our children a lot. And we say, well, you have to have a father of confession, or if you're starting to serve, you have to have a father of confession. You start doing this. And it's just one of those check boxes that we do. Did you take communion? Did you have confession within the last couple of months? Are you doing Agbeya, once every 3 years when you remember that you have the book on your shelf? It's just sort of these random things that we say, oh yeah, I'm a good Christian, I just do these kinds of things, checkbox. But he's saying if you want to live and have Christ live in you, if you want to be a real Christian, then the way that you do this is through confession. And how do I know this? Because I do this. And not only have I done this to one person, he does it to someone else as well, right? He's speaking about his spiritual father, who is St. Isidore. And St. Isidore's spiritual guide, again, is St. Macarius the Great, whose spiritual guide was St. Anthony the Great, whose spiritual guides were those people that were in the town that he went and cultivated all of those virtues from before venturing out into the desert, whose spiritual guide was someone else as well, right? So there's this chain that's there, that's inherited. And that's how he's saying here, that we may know how to judge what is good and bad according to what they have handed down, right? What they have traditioned. And he goes on. The instruction will not only teach a young man how to walk on the right paths to the true way of discretion, but will also preserve him unhurt from all the snares and traps of the enemy. Now, I want to pause here for just a second, because again, to the point that I was making earlier, we usually say that to our youth, right? You see, a young man is supposed to be doing this, but St. Moses at this time is not a young man, right? Moses at this time has already lived quite a life up to this point and has now achieved the level of being the spiritual guide as well. When John Cassian goes, this is in the beginning of the 5th century, and Moses was there in the desert from the end of the 4th. So he's been there for a long time, and now he's the one that is practiced and tried and true. And so you have to see that when he's speaking about this, he's not just speaking to our youth, he's speaking to us, right? He's speaking to the adults. The young man is not the one that's young in age. It's the one that's young in his experience in the faith, right? Not young in the faith, right? Like how many years have you been a Christian for? But how many years have you actually lived as a Christian? And I would say virtually all of us are children in this regard, right? And so this is what he's saying. If a young man wants to grow in this, this is who he goes and submits to. Whoever lives not by his own judgment, but by the example of our forebears, shall never be deceived, nor shall the crafty foe be able to take advantage of the ignorance of a person who does not know how to hide all the thoughts coming to birth in his heart, because of a dangerous embarrassment, but either reject them or accepts them according to the considered opinion of the elders. Okay? So he's saying you won't fall if you actually live this way, if you go and submit your thoughts and your actions to someone who is practiced. He's not just saying just go and do it to any Joe Schmo, right? Don't just walk up to someone and say, as everybody commonly says now, well, if you read in the book of James, it says, confess to one another. So I could just pick the guy that's standing next to me and I'll say, hey, this is what it is that I did. Okay, you're forgiven. This is what it is that I did. You're forgiven. And there's no depth there, right? He's saying, go to someone that has this experience, someone who is an elder, right? Presbyteros, like what it was that Moses, the arch prophet, was saying in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy. which we led off with in the beginning of this talk here, right? Go and ask the elders, because the elders, through their experience, can discern. And that discernment, that discretion comes from humility. And that humility comes from having submitted your own thoughts in truth to somebody else. So that they could also come and tell you, and this has happened to me several times, when I go and I speak to my own spiritual guide and I say, this is what it is that I'm thinking about, and I think this is what the issue is, and then he brings to light that my thoughts are not even what I think they are, right? And I'm thinking to myself, but these are my thoughts. Like, how could you possibly know that this is not the fullness or the depth of what it is that's there? But it's because he has this experience, right? He knows there's certain symptoms that are pointing towards something. And then we sit there and we go through it, and then I realize I don't even know about myself, right? I don't know my own experience. But when I go and I submit to somebody else, then they can show me that through their experience. And the more that happens, the more that I realize I don't know anything. But that's precisely the point here, right? For as soon as a wicked thought has been revealed, it loses its power. And even before the judgment of discretion is exercised, the loathsome serpent, drawn out as it were into the light, from its dark and subterranean cave by the power of the confession, departs a kind of laughing stock, an object of dishonor. For his harmful counsels hold sway in us as long as they lie concealed in our hearts. If you don't expose it, if it's just in your heart and you say, I'm gonna pray. I'm gonna pray to God, which is not a bad thing, right? That's a good thing. I'm gonna say, God, support me in this. I don't want this to be exposed. I don't want anyone to know this about me. What would people think? What would my spiritual guide think of me? I'm supposed to be X, Y, and Z, right? And the image that I've shown them over the years is that I'm up here. What could they possibly think of me if I suddenly show them what I'm really struggling with? So God, I don't want to reveal that, right? So let's just keep that between you and me. That continues the battle. The battle continues to go on and on and on because it's not revealed. You'll find, and you'll see this even in your own life as well, if there's something that, if there's a passion that wants to overtake you, if you reveal it to somebody and it just comes out into the open, it really will disappear. It's not like the fight then ends and then you don't have to fight with this ever again. It's that you get momentary comfort. There is support there, right? There's something that brings you back to yourself so that you realize that you're not just completely encompassed by this passion. And you get a little bit of respite. And this is why the monks go and they confess their thoughts on a daily basis to the ones that they trust. Now, if we all did that to the priests here, we'd completely overload them. But they're not overloaded, right? Because most of us don't do that. Even a small fraction of us don't really do that. Because we're not ready to be humble. We're not ready to truly submit ourselves. And so this is where spiritual guidance comes from. It's not someone that's there so that they can dictate to you, this is what you're supposed to do. It's that you willingly submit, because in submitting, in humbling yourself, you become more like Christ. He who humbled himself and took the form of a servant. Can you humble yourself? Can you say to yourself, well, I know that I'm supposed to be this big shot. I'm the doctor, the dentist, or the lawyer, or the engineer, or I'm none of those things. I'm the best father in the world. I'm the greatest mom. I take care of my kids. I do whatever it is, right? However it is that you think of yourself. If you can go and humble yourself from this and truly expose who you are to someone that is practiced, so that you shouldn't be trying to pull a fast one on anyone, but you might even be trying to pull a fast one on yourself here. Someone that's practiced and tried and true, that knows what's happening, then you expose that and they can guide you further towards Christ. That's the whole point of the spiritual guidance. And that never ends. There's no age, there's no time in your life at which that ends. There's no point at which you say, well, I used to confess more when I was younger. I don't do it now anymore because, what kind of things could I possibly fall into now? I just go home, I watch TV, I take care of my kids. Or my kids are grown up and they're out of the house. I don't really do much. I just sit on Facebook and I, watch Logos TV or CTV. I don't really do very much, right? Like what could I possibly? And that's the problem, right? Is that we're not aware of ourselves. And as long as we're not aware of ourselves, then the battle rages on. Now, I'm going to end with this because we've been speaking for quite some time here. I'll read the story first and then I'll make the point. This is Samuel when he was a child with Eli. For those that don't know, Eli was serving in the temple and Samuel was dedicated to the temple by his mother Hannah. Hannah couldn't conceive. She cried in church, in the temple. God granted her Samuel, and then she dedicated Samuel to the temple. Samuel's living there, and Eli is not a great priest, nor is he a great father. His sons are really off the path here. And that's the setup for this, right? One day, Eli, whose eyesight was failing, was lying in his usual place. Before the lamp of God had gone out, Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was located. Then the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, "Here I am." He ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "I didn't call," Eli replied. "Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Once again the Lord called, "Samuel." Samuel got up, went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "I didn't call, my son," he replied. "Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, because the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. Once again, for the third time, the Lord called Samuel. He got up, went to Eli, and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli understood that the Lord was calling the boy. He told Samuel, "Go and lie down. If he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came, stood there, and called as before, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel responded, "Speak, for your servant is listening." We all know the story, right? Everyone knows this. What are the interesting things that are here? One is that even though Samuel has effectively spent his whole life in the temple and is not just always constantly in the temple in general, the place where he sleeps is right next to the Ark of the Covenant, right? It's next to the throne of God as it was revealed to the people of Israel. It says here, now Samuel did not yet know the Lord because the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. He didn't know him from an experiential standpoint, right? He still hadn't experienced him. He knows all the things that they're doing in the temple, right? He's serving with Eli. He's there with the priests. He's doing what needs to be done in the temple all the time. But he doesn't know the voice of the Lord, even though he's there all the time. The word of the Lord had not yet been received in him, because he didn't have that. Now, the reason why I included this is because I think many times we want to find the greatest of spiritual guides that exists in all of the world, and you venture out far and wide and try to find these people, and you go to our Egyptian deserts, or you go to other monasteries, or you find out that there's some priest that really gives great talks, and you want to get in touch with him because this guy understands me. He'll get me, right? And you want to rely on that experience, and that's really good. But many of us don't have access to that. Samuel did not have access to that. Samuel had Eli, who is not a good priest. And Eli, even though he was not a good priest, could still discern that the one that was speaking to Samuel was the Lord. And because Samuel submitted to Eli, right, his whole life is submission. His whole life is being a servant. He just listens to what it is that he says. He calls, he runs. He says, "No, lay down," goes back. 3 times. You'd think that Samuel would be going crazy by this point, right? It says, you called me. No, I didn't call you. Go lie down. No, you told me that last time. He doesn't say that, right? He just goes and he does what needs to be done. Just tell me what to do. And Eli, even though he's a bad priest, can still allow for one of the greatest prophets to flower in the temple of the Lord here. And that is important for us to know as well, because we don't need the giant of the church to be able to discern for us what's happening with us. We need to submit in humility. It's from our side. This stuff was not happening to Samuel because of how Eli was, right? It's not that because Eli was a great priest, then Samuel was chosen so that he could be the servant and the prophet for God, right? It's that God said, this boy submits himself in humility. And so I will work through him. And that word can even come through a bad priest. Because the priest is not the issue here. The person is, right? The individual who submits himself in humility. And I think that is one of the greatest things that we can learn how to do, and one of the most challenging. I'll tell you just a quick story here from the life of St. Macarius the Great, because he's known to be the man of humility. Is that one time he was walking in the desert, and a demon came up to him with a scythe. A scythe is one of those things that they cut down wheat and grain with and grass, right? It's when you see like the Grim Reaper in Halloween, it's got that long pole and it's got that really long thing, right? Like a sickle, right? And it's a scythe. And he goes and he hits him. He hits St. Macarius the Great, and nothing happens. And the demon tells St. Macarius, he says, everything that you do, I do. You fast for a certain number of hours, I don't eat. You keep vigil and you stay up at night, I never sleep. But there's one thing that you do. There's one thing that you have that I don't. He says, what is that? He says, it's your humility that conquers me. And St. Macarius lifted up his hands so that he could pray, and the demon departed. Now, it puzzled me for a long period of time. Why would they include that story about the scythe in the beginning? Such a random thing when they're just going to set this story up about humility. Why has he got to be hit by a scythe? And I went and I watched a video of people using this so that they could cut down grass and stuff in their backyard. And it cuts right down to the ground, right? With no effort, right down to the ground. And they can do big sweeping motions and just wipe out whatever it is that's in front of them. But you can't touch the ground, because once you touch the ground, then it loses, the blade dulls, right? And so you have to be very practiced in this, that you go almost right down to the ground so that you could cut whatever is there. When he went to go hit St. Macarius, he can't bring him down any further, because St. Macarius was so humble that he's already earth. And that's what the word humility means, right? Is homos. Homos is the word for humility. It means earth, it means dirt, right? So he sees that even if he hits him with the thing that's supposed to take him right down to the ground, he can't take him down at all because of his humility, because he already sees himself as he is. That's what we're supposed to strive for. And the way that we're able to obtain that is the same way that he did, and how he taught the people that were under him as well, and that's to submit to somebody else. Any questions? Wonderful. Let's stand up to pray.
In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, and mixed with you, say with all thanksgiving, Our Father who art in heaven,